My name is Fetzer, and I'm a professor of French in the department. For the last couple of years, I've been studying, or I've been exposed to the poetry of Tunis Tabet, who is a Tunisian poet, and it was actually by quite serendipitously that I became aware of her poetry. I was in a bookstore in Tunis. There are two French-speaking bookstores, and so I always, when I'm in those types of bookstores, I go and then look to see what's going on in poetry. So I got, that's how I became familiar with Tunis Tabet. So the title I've given this is Engagement, Revolution, and Verbal Aspect, and the Poetic Voice of Tunis Tabet. I've studied voice, a verbal aspect in some other poets, and it's something that I'm going to continue to do for a while. So in Tunisia, they just had an election on Sunday, and it was the first of two rounds. It was the first round of their presidential election, and the people that they expected to win did not win, and two outsiders won the top two spots at 18% and 16%. And so sometime in October, there will be another election to determine who will be the next president. So this goes back to 2010, at the time of what we call the Arab Spring. Events in Tunisia at the end of 2010 launched a series of changes of seismic proportions in the sphere of government and in the areas of social cohesion, civic responsibility, and awareness. These changes provided Tunisians with long-awaited opportunities for self-determination. The revolution that ensued, which went from December 17, 2010 to February 27, 2011, began in the town of Sidi Bouzid with the self-immolation of a fruits and vegetable salesman who was distraught by the lack of economic opportunity that was never redressed. Tunisians saw the images of the immolation in the media and on social media and took to the streets in a collective expression of revolt against the do-nothing, self-serving government. And I would just say something about this particular event, which Tunisians were horrified that this vendor set himself on fire. And if you look, you can still find that video accounts of that. Midway through the revolution, the revolution was a revolution of demonstrations, people taking to the streets. It was not an armed revolution, it was just a lot of demonstrations and revolts in that sense. Midway through the revolution, President Ben Ali, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, who had been in power since 1987, and he had been the second president of Tunisia, the first one being Habib Bourguiba. He fled to Saudi Arabia on January 14, 2011. As far as the revolution is concerned, the underlying causes, lack of jobs, desire for increased liberty, an impulse toward democracy, and these things had been building for a number of years. And people had been really upset with Ben Ali for quite some time before that. An interim government was installed. There was an interim president. There was an interim prime minister. Instabilities continued even after February 27, which was the recognized end of the revolution, and these instabilities continued until the transition period of March and April. So within this whole context of the revolution, some new literary voices have emerged, and others which were already present have gained prominence. So, such is the case with Tunis Tabet, who's a professor of French. She's an organizer of writing workshops. She's a regular contributor to the arts and culture column of the newspaper, Le Temps de Tunisie. It's a daily newspaper. She's also a poet. She's also given a TED Talk on how teaching is an act of resistance. It's an excellent TED Talk. It's in French, but it's very, very good. So she's a poet. Her poems, which coincide with, in many cases, with her columns in Le Temps de Tunisie, illustrate a voice that's courageous, that's engaged in the events and values of her compatriots, tuned into the potential of the poetic world, and sensitized to the political, to the cultural, and the social events of her homeland. As is the case with many Tunisian poets, and we think of Taha Bakri, Amina Said, the literary imagination in her work, in her poems, draws heavily upon Tunisian landscapes and cultural reference. The poetry of Tunis Tabé is replete with images of blue seas, expansive skies, desert sands, as well as jasmine, olive trees, and palm groves. In her revolution and post-revolutionary poems gathered in her book J'ai tissé l'espérance d'épines et le fil de soie in 2016, we gain an appreciation of the voice of the poet by giving attention to the aspect, verbal aspect, by which the process, verbal process, plays out. To rehearse the role and identity of aspect and process in morphology, we recall, this is just trying to make things, this is a very cliche view of process and aspect. Whereas process refers to the action of the verb, aspect refers to the internal duration of that process, particularly of its limits and its progress or its unfolding. Aspect then indicates how time passes and how an action unfolds within a framework. Thus, apart from dimensions pertaining to tense or mood, aspect plays a key role in illuminating voice. Grammarians affirm that in French, the process of an event can be assessed within its successive stages from beginning to end. So I've just given you several characteristics of aspect, or several possibilities of it. These are just a very few. It could be durative or imperfective. I'm not going to be talking about that. It could be incoitive, passing from one state to another, or it could be perfective, having been completed, and when the process is viewed as having been achieved. So what I want to talk about, so that this first part of the introduction is a longer, okay, don't judge the rest of the paper by this, the rest of the paper is rather short, but the thesis statement is that the poet's use of aspect in the texts of this collection informs and reflects the diverse moments and phases of the revolution and its aftermath. So, at the outset of the revolution, when the Tunisians themselves were debating the scope and the direction of the demonstrations, Tabet's questioning voice highlights the indefinite duration of the turmoil. And in an early poem of the sequence, the poet is conscious of her craft and expresses uncertainty about the efficacy of words to achieve her goals. All right, so I have a translation, a rough translation of poems. So this is a poem that is entitled Mots amers, bitter words. It's from December of 2010. This is the month that the demonstrations began. Although brief, the text finds cohesions through the use of an aphora. And let me let's just take a moment to read it. The olive trees scream and die. The sea invades my laughter. Fig trees bring forth bitter fruit. The arid sap mourns. The palm tree listens to my shattered rhymes. A dream of silence cannot fly off. The wall is so high that my words cannot climb. Does my revolt reach you? Words row adrift, attempting to rhyme, to reach you. to attain the other shore. Do you hear them? Although brief, the text finds cohesion through the use of anaphora. The poem's title, Bitter Words, or mots amers in French, constitutes a nominal group that forms the basis for repetition, since words, or mots, are recurrent through the text. And in the French version, the word mot, M-O-T-S, appears several times throughout the text. Along with the preoccupation with words, we find attention to rhymes, fractured rhymes, rimes fracassées, the shattered rhymes here. Attempts once again to rhyme, tenter de rime, attempt to rhyme. As for the second part of the nominal group, bitter, amer, we find in the text several figures that convey sadness or bitterness. Olive trees that scream and die, fig trees that give birth to bitter fruit, the weeping of arid sap, and so on. More importantly, however, although the word bitter, which is amer in French, occurs once more in the poem, the anaphoric French word mer, see, mur, bois, and meur serve to construct a tight homophonic network in the poem. From the standpoint of the action of the verbs, however, in this poem, the verbal action is almost exclusively imperfective, connoting an unfolding still in progress. Thus, when we read that the olive trees scream and die, or that the palm trees listen to shattered rhymes, or that a fig tree gives birth to bitter fruit, we note the durative and sometimes static quality of the process. Likewise, on several occasions in which the poet poses the question openly, does my revolt reach you? Ma révolte vous parvient-elle? And do you hear them? Les entendez-vous? The interrogative form of the expression only reinforces the verb's unaccomplished character. In a text titled January 14, this is the day that President Ben Ali fled Tunisia. This is really surprising for them. All of a sudden they found out that they wanted him to leave, but all of a sudden they found out that he did, and he had gone to Saudi Arabia. A succession of anaphoric injunctions, tell them, dites-leur, forms the framework for verbal actions that sustain static conditions based on previous accomplishments. So the poem reads as follows. I'll read it in French, and you can follow along if you want. Dites-leur que la saison de la colère gronde. Dites-leur que le printemps est en avance. Dites-leur que le jasmin a refleuri au cœur de janvier. Dites-leur que les fragrances en font l'espérance. Dites-leur que nous ne sommes pas plus éclatés et seuls. Dites-leur que sous le pavé bourgeonnent les étoiles. Dites-leur que les déchirures, les blessures sont semences d'éclat, de rire. Dites-leur que nous avons enterré nos peurs avec nos morts. Dites-leur que nos cris bravent leurs armes. Dites-leur que nos larmes ne sont plus amères. Dites-leur que nous avons déchiré nos muselières. Dites-leur que nous avons poussé les murs de nos sables et déterré la lumière. Each successive injunction introduces an utterance that invokes the revolution and puts into motion a directive act. Some of these injunctive sentences assert durative, ongoing action. The season of anger is brewing. Springtime's on March. Fragrances give birth to hope. Others affirm present conditions by calling forth accomplished acts. Jasmine has flowered again in the heart of January. We've buried our fears with our dead. We've torn off our muzzles. Tell them that we've torn off our muzzles with the implicit freeing of oneself for self-expression. The final injunction, tell them that we've pushed the wall of our sands and unearthed the light, relies on accomplished terminative aspect in order to imply a new situation, one that results in lack of constraints and has access to elimination. Far from being uniform, the diversity of aspects of verbs of the poem strengthens the injunctions enacted by the speaking voice. and produces an utterance that asserts a new reality by dint of intervening event and evolving conditions. Given that the process of the verb is measured from the moment's action until it's completed, if one views the action from a vantage point external to that action in its entirety, then the aspect best reflecting this action is referred to as global or non-durative. This is the aspect represented by a simple future. And when Tunes Tabé makes use exclusively of the future tense, as she does in the next text, nous passerons, she envisions a series of events or situations that do not belong to the realm of reality. Nous passerons, of course, is a reference to the 1930s to Spain situation.